Okay, hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. My name is Veli-Pekka Kurunmäki and I'm the Director of Professional Sports Business at Firstbeat. I'll be hosting and co-presenting the topic today together with our Head of Physiology, Mr. Tero Myllymäki. And today we are going to talk about physiological analytics and in more detail about the balancing the training and recovery in professional sports. We will be sharing some insights of the latest player status analysis, which was pre-launched earlier in this year in CES show in Vegas. The presentation will take approximately 30 minutes, and we will also have a short Q&A session at the end if the time permits. And feel free to type in any questions during the presentation to the chat screen you can see on the left side. The questions what we don't address on live, we will reply in written afterwards. As an introduction, I would like to start with this simplified model of coaching process. So before every project or training period, you normally define the targets for the period. And then you create a plan with best available knowledge to reach the targets set for this period. And after a good plan, you start executing the plan. But along the process, it's good to check whether or not the players are on the right track. Measuring and quantifying the load and individual training responses are essential to know if the players are reaching the goal set for each day. And in most of the cases, adjustments are needed to the training plan on individual basis in order to reach the targets. And targets normally in this content are increased performance or minimizing the injury risk. And where Firstbeat can help the coaches is in verifying the plan through training load and recovery monitoring, and in supporting the coach to do the right adjustments. In this example, you can see an example of a training week during the season. And as you can see, the training programming wise, it looks pretty simple as they have 3 games during that week. And so the rest of the days is just about recovery and preparing the players for the next game. And this is a screen capture of our sports system and showing the team average levels. And also the responses looks pretty logical. They have the high load during the game days, low load between game days, and recovery is moving to the right direction on each morning of the game. But however, if you look the individual responses on that same training week, you can see that they are much more widely spread. In this chart, the values are described in training impulse, trim values for each day. But there's a lot of variation between the players, how they are responding to the load. And if we look the same week and we look the recovery, there are even bigger variation among the players. And in these charts, by recovery trend, I mean a 7 days average value for the quick recovery test. And we recently added to the sports platform a ranking view where the coaches can easily sort the players based on the key metrics such as response to a single training. As you can see on the orange, it's a trim value from the session. Then you can see the acute load and you can see the recovery values, which can be sorted by the variable. Also, we added color codes and individual scaling to visualize the status of each player. But as you can see, there are still various combinations about the load and recovery. So it's really still needs brain work to make the conclusions. Can the athlete still push harder, or what do they need at that or on the following days? And also the crucial point that after making the decisions based on the data, how do you communicate the results to the coaching staff? And that kind of process lead us to develop further this player status analysis to help coaches in their work. So we started with the literature reviews about the load and injury relationships and recovery and performance relationships. We also conducted some of the retrospective data analysis with our key partners to learn what we can see from the data afterwards. And currently we are in a pilot phase that we offer a player status analysis as a service, where we do the data mining and provide the team and individual level reporting to the coaches, providing a single score about the player status. Is the training load or the training and recovery balanced, or do they have an increased risk of injury? But now Tero will continue about the physiological backgrounds of the player status analytics. Tero, well, stage is yours.
Thank you, Veli-Pekka, and hello everyone. So I will next go through the basic background physiology and then the principles of our player status analysis. So the idea behind the player status analysis is to detect from physiological parameters whether the player is doing okay, to best keep the load on the player in balance and to help in avoiding injuries. And I think that balancing the training is especially important in the team sports where seasons are long and the players need to be able to perform well throughout the whole season. So if we look at the training outcomes, those can be detected by what the player is doing. So looking at the external workload, which is more like the biomechanical view on the topic, and also by how the player is responding to the training. So it's the internal workload. And I think we should always keep in mind, also as Veli-Pekka said, that each player is unique, so there are different responses to similar external work. So therefore we focus on individual physiological reactions in our analytics. Here we look at the training outcome from a bit different perspective. So if we think about athletic training, it is clear that there needs to be a certain amount of training load to improve fitness and performance. So physical work all year round is required to make those training adaptations possible. So therefore one of the key elements of training is the chronic load the player has been doing. So it's the long-term load an athlete is habituated to, and it's also clear that if the long-term load is very low, those training adaptations are basically impossible. So it's the chronic load, the one which determines the fitness and performance effects of training, and only with adequate long-term load the fitness level can be at the level required in professional sports. Then if we look training in a shorter window, that's the period where those acute effects of training occur. So this describes the acute disturbance of body's homeostasis due to training, and those acute effects that are disappearing after a few days. And of course this short-term load then is eventually forming the long-term load. So from here we get into the ratio between long-term load and short-term load. So when these are well balanced, it means that the load remains about equal both in longer and shorter time frame, and it's very balanced type of training. So, but it's not very effective training if the chronic load is very low. Even the ratio between long and short-term load is well balanced. So this ratio cannot be the only guide in determining whether the player is training well and productively. Then we have also a third element, and it's recovery. So no matter how hard the training is, an athlete needs to respond to training positively, meaning that they recover after training. And that's something that I have illustrated here. So recovery is sort of a support element, and if you have a very good recovery, the more load you can put on the athlete. The better the recovery, the harder you can practice. But it's a very careful play not to crack this support element and go to overreaching or overtraining state. And if we think about recovery, it has one additional benefit over monitoring the training load only, because recovery tells also about other factors in life than only training. So if we are only looking the load the athletes are doing, we are missing the effects of those 20 hours outside practice, which may affect a lot of what players' bodies are able to sustain. So if we have all these elements in good shape, so there is adequate short-term and long-term load, we have very balanced training, and there is good recovery to help to manage the training load, then it's a very powerful combination for balanced and productive training. So next I will go through how we analyze these various factors and how they are combined in the player status analysis. So we are using TRIMP. It's the training impulse originally developed by Eric Bannister to quantify training load accumulated during the session. So TRIMP takes into consideration the intensity of exercise as calculated by the heart rate reserve method and the duration of exercise. So originally TRIMP was modeled by examining heart rate responses together with blood lactate accumulated during incremental exercise, and that was then multiplied by the session duration. And the original formula, TRIMP formula, used average heart rate for the whole session, but in Firstbeat analytics we use more shorter periods, so we are able to model the TRIMP accumulation more dynamically, which allows the usage of TRIMP also during interval type of training. And the acute training load then is the sum of last week's training. So it's the 7-day TRIMP sum. And this acute load is personalized, so we track the training history and adapt over time to what sort of load the athlete has been doing. And as said, all players are individual, so the same TRIMP limits cannot be used for all. And now if you are following the training, the acute training load, you can see that when the last week has been very easy and when there is very high load and adjust accordingly the load. And if we are then having more data and looking more to the history, we can, from these acute training loads, we get to this chronic long-term training load, which describes the typical workload the athlete has been doing during the last month. So it's the typical average week during the last month. And when we have these acute and chronic training load, we can assess the balance between them. And this information can be found at the moment as an output in our data export. And the sweet spot of training is as said, when the ratio is around 1, so the acute and chronic load is in balance, and also from injury prevention perspective, it is safest not to try to increase the load very heavily, for example, doubling the training load in a short period of time, but also on the other hand to keep practicing quite steadily to keep the fitness up. So it's not so advisable to reduce the training very much in a short period of time. Then we also have the quick recovery test, and I think this is especially good in team settings, as it's very easily performed and does not take a lot of time to perform this quick recovery test. And here we collect 3 minutes of data, and from that data we use the most representative data for assessing the recovery state for that day. And with this quick recovery test, we want to track the status of the autonomic nervous system activity, and we use heart rate and heart rate variability to do that. And as these heart rate variability values are highly individual, we personally calibrate the analysis. So we take the measurement history for each player and detect which are typical values for the player and how much there is typically variation between measurements. And then from this information we are able to detect the personal recovery state. And here a term smallest worthwhile change is used. So that's very much used and also proven in scientific studies that it's a very good way, very good approach to analyze heart rate variability in a personal level and assess recovery based on that. So that was a presentation about these key elements that we use in the player status analysis. So we have the recovery, we have the acute versus chronic training load balance, and we have the acute training load. And as we have those measurements, the players are doing measurements, we combine this information, all available information, and we put that data into the system and provide this kind of overall player status, which can then be used for training decisions and modifying the training if needed. And one important thing to note is that we might not always have everything available, or there might be sometimes there are measurements and maybe missing some data. For example, recovery, we probably won't have recovery values for each day, so we have to have a system which are able to analyze all the data that is available for the player, and based on those values and data to provide the player status. So here is an example of this kind of report. So we have this acute training load here. It's individually scaled, and for example here it's a little bit higher than the optimal range, and this is the last 7 days how much there has been training load based on those TRIMP values. And we can also say that it's if we think about injury prevention perspective, it's advisable not to go to this red area, that very loading the athlete very heavily, but on the other hand also it's not good to be very in the light end, so training very easily, rather to trying to keep the load quite steady, and especially if we look this acute versus chronic training load, trying to find the balance and not going to this area that you are increasing the load very much or either decreasing the load very much. So trying to find the right balance. And of course we cannot say that a player will definitely get an injury, because higher risk or unbalanced training does not definitely mean that an injury will happen, but of course it might increase a risk if the training is quite unbalanced. But it's also clear that sometimes there can be times when an athlete needs to take the load down for enhancing recovery, or to increase the load to seek his limits, to have this kind of super compensation which occur when you are a bit out of your comfort zone. Here is also recovery, and as said, this is also individualized, and in this player status analysis we are looking the last 14 days, so last 2 weeks of measurements. And as we know that the athletes typically do not measure recovery each day, we also have to take into account when those recovery measurements have been conducted. So if the measurements are done, for example, 2 weeks ago, we reduce the effect of recovery on the overall player status. In addition, we consider also the recovery results. So if the player has got, for example, 3 poor values, then it's a very clear sign that now the player is not responding positively to the training, and we increase the effect of recovery on the player status. And as we have these 3 elements available, it might be that we don't always have each data from each of these, but anyways, we are combining the information available to produce this kind of player status score. And it's indicating how balanced the training is in the given moment. If there is very limited amount of data available, we indicate that by showing this kind of lowered reliability. So, for example, here there hasn't been much of a data, so it's we have been assessing the player status, but we indicate that this now at that moment we really cannot be sure about this because there is such a limited amount of this kind of measured data available, and I think it's for the most informative use of physiology analytics in general. I think the measurements should be conducted regularly. So if there is very limited amount of data, it's very difficult to follow how the athlete is progressing. So of course, then we have this kind of traffic light type of approach. That this well-balanced area is the green area, the desired area, the most balanced area for the status. So it's area where there are no signs of poor recovery. There is enough training load, and the load is also quite balanced in terms of acute versus chronic training load. Then we have this red area, out of balance area. There are signs of poor recovery, so clearly seeing that now the responses are something that we don't want to see, that athlete is not recovering. There might be very little or very high training load, or the training load is increasing or decreasing very fast. So this is something that you want to consider, that what kind of changes you want to do to the training programming. For example, in this example report for the individual player, there he has been on the moderately balanced status, so training very easily and still recovering well, moderately, not so well, even though the load is very low. So therefore, at that moment the player has been in moderately balanced training state. But as their time goes by, the athlete has achieved this kind of very well balanced training state. So training enough, optimal training load, also the acute and chronic training load is well balanced, and he is recovering well. So there isn't any signs of anything that you need to worry about. And as we do these kind of reports for each player of the team, we are able to provide this kind of team summary. So we use this traffic light type of approach. We show player who has something that we need to consider or take a closer look on what's going on there. We have this yellow area, moderately balanced training and well balanced training. So it's very easy to get an overview on the team. And we also show the team trends, so like the average value for each of the players, how it's progressing, and show the values for half of the athletes. It's this dark gray area, and then all athletes, how they are distributed based on this player status data. So that was a presentation on how we analyze the status of the player, and that was my part. So now I will turn over to Veli-Pekka. So Veli-Pekka, please.
Okay, thank you, Tero. So I hope you got an understanding about the player status analysis service, how it's working in the backgrounds. But I would just like to also remind that the daily coaching work can be done effectively through the sports software as well. So that in a dashboard you can see the training response, you can see acute load, readiness scores, and you can, with the data export, you get information, more detailed information about the acute and chronic load and recovery. But what this player status service, what additional benefits it can provide? I would say one thing is definitely the effortless analysis for the coaches, because it takes a lot of time to analyze every individual athlete and looking their history data, current responses, and then the recovery trends. So we can do it as a service to analyze the data you have been collecting, and we recommend to use it as a regular check, and it will help and support the coaches in interpreting the data. So just kind of verifying if the findings are in line with what the findings that you do in everyday coaching. And then one important thing is also just that this is a good way to communicate and report the data to the coaching staff who necessarily don't know anything about the physiology or coaching science itself, but having a already existing report showing just that who are in an increased risk of getting injured and who are in a well-balanced zone. So this is a kind of additional components that we also